Good afternoon, everyone. My task is very simple. I've got three things I want to achieve. First of all, keep you awake after your lunch. The second thing is to try and summarize a topic which could take 2 days of conference in about an hour and a half with a panel. And the last thing is to challenge Dr. Post just a little bit with your dog on the potential value of unstructured data and why we shouldn't necessarily give up today on having more data yet. So that's the task, and I hope that I'll give you in the next 15 minutes just a snapshot of digital health. Before I do, just a bit of fun, and the reason this is important is just to try and understand how quickly the external world is changing and what it means for us. So look at this on the left, and it tells you how many weeks did it take to get to 100 million users. So obviously the telephone took 75 years, Facebook 4.5 years, Pokemon Go 3 weeks. Now one can argue about the societal value of the telephone, it's not, but yet Pokemon Go, 100 million. Now if you just look at this is the context of the environment into which we're operating, where it takes between 7 to 10 years, maybe getting shorter over time, to develop a drug. But these changes are happening in society and happening in healthcare. So by the time a drug is developed, the question is, has the healthcare system and the healthcare practice and technology moved on to potentially make the drug less relevant? So just going back to the definition of digital health, because we all have our own views, we all have our different definitions, and our panelists will give you their own perspectives. This is a definition that works for me, which is the convergence of biological, engineering, and physical sciences to enhance and personalize healthcare. And we can debate this at length during the panel. And the reason this is important is that we've already talked, and I will mention a bit more, this concept of superconvergence. And I think Dr. Post was mentioning how the future generation has to master different skills to apply them to sciences. You've already heard about the genomic revolution and the cost of the genome, but actually even now, all of the omics, and there's a baseline project many of you have heard from Google, for example, which is going to make available terabytes of data per visit on every omic in the human body as a baseline, to be able to reference it to disease states. And then this is just a graph from Eric Topol's book about the great inflection of medicine. And it's somewhere now, if you were to look at that graph. I don't know what that means, but the question is this the Gutenberg moment in medicine where when the printing press came, it democratized information and made it available and took it out of the hands of the elite? Is digital health going to actually do this and democratize health? This is a very busy graph, and it's really to try and illustrate this concept of superconvergence, which has been creeping up in healthcare anyway. And it talks about the different types of technologies that are already permeating into different parts of the world and being applied to the application of health. Things like cloud-based services. We talked about the mobile and how your mobile phones will become potentially your electronic health records if they could be made accessible for the future. And we know that Apple's doing a huge amount in this particular space. But what about big data? Is it big data or is it minimally viable data? And we're going to have that debate as we go through today. Telemedicine. We don't talk much about telemedicine, but if you look in China, there are already 140 plus cloud-based hospitals as they de-urbanize the healthcare from the centers out into the different districts. Now, that has a huge implication because it allows people to be treated at home. It ensures that virtual visits and diagnostic tools are available. There aren't necessarily the experts there. So how do we guide and help guide physician decision-making? What about wearables? What about home sensors in this context? Can we now actually do what is happening in many parts of the world, which is bring the clinical care back into the home for the patient? There's going to be a lot more discussion about wearables throughout this talk, but I'll just quickly mention AI. You talked about artificial intelligence earlier, and I'm a big believer in the fact that this will force many of the healthcare professionals, people who train in traditional medicine like myself, to actually take a higher order of expertise and start to look at our jobs, which were somewhat repetitive, and actually start to look at the higher value end of what we do. And we've talked a lot about the omics, and you also heard about cell-based therapy. So this is not a comprehensive list. It just shows you the types of technologies that are actually impinging on changing healthcare. This is an example that I'm sure you're pretty familiar. It was published in JAMA from the London group, DMind, which actually looked at how a machine can actually read fundus retinal photographs, as well as experts. Now it's obviously been shown in imaging, MRI imaging, it's been shown on pathology. So this is obviously a good example of where AI can truly add value into a healthcare system. And you can get this out into places where there aren't the experts, and you can see with mobile technology and these tools how you can actually bring healthcare, make it much more accessible in many parts of the world. This is just a snapshot of health apps, and I'm sorry why the title has slipped, but health apps are popping up everywhere. There's thousands of them. And they're being applied for digital biomarkers. There's now examples of drug companions. There's drug replacements, and I'll come to that in a second. But we also have apps for disease prevention. And if you take a company called Amada, they use an AI personalized healthcare algorithm with coaching. They publish their data. They've shown they can prevent the transition to diabetes in a pre-diabetic state, and they're getting reimbursed for it. There's no drugs involved. This is just one example, and there are many, of a digital biomarker. So we talk about molecular markers, and we talk about that kind of precision medicine, but this is a digital biomarker by MoveCare, which takes 12 symptoms plus an algorithm. And they presented this at ASCO, at the oncology conference, and showed that they can actually triage high-risk patients. So could this be a way that takes a lot of other contextual data that is not intuitive or necessarily specifically targeted to a biology, but show that they can actually make predictions on who's going to get worse? So there are some intangible factors that are accounted for in these types of algorithms. So the age of the behaviorome, if you want to name it, another ohm, that takes a lot of these characteristics and puts them into a digital biomarker with an algorithm, is not far away. Then we talk about drugs plus solutions and digital therapeutics, right? And the last 18 months have been pretty exciting. Even though it's an old technology, but the Proteus chip was approved by the FDA last year for schizophrenia. It's a small chip for a drug, and it's called Abilify MySite. And yes, it's not very revolutionary. It tells you had the drug, but it can also tell you some other information as well. But the more important thing is it's the first time that we're seeing these advances. But what kind of intrigued me was there's a company called Pear Therapeutics. That is the first digital therapeutic, pure digital therapeutic, no drug. They went through phase 2, they went through phase 3, they went to the FDA, they published their data, they did randomized trials, and they got approval as if they were a biologic drug. And and now a doctor can actually prescribe a digital therapeutic. Just something for the discussion later. We talk about drugs plus. Why? Because we think that in many cases, and maybe our imprecise knowledge of biology to date, but the biological treatment alone does not predict all of the outcomes. So we are looking at drugs plus as a non-pharmacological approach to adjunct combined with a drug to improve patient outcomes in any of the parameters, so efficacy, safety, adherence, better experience. And it could be a hardware, a software, a service. And it can be used across the value chain for diagnosis and monitoring, medication management, or disease management. Now, there's a reason for this, and I'll talk a bit about it. This is where big data or unstructured data may help us to work out, well, what else does the patient require that is not addressed specifically from the known biology of the disease, and how can we address that? So just one slide on a very big topic, this is the universe of real-world data. And it comes in many forms. So anything outside of the randomized controlled trial, you get structured data, it's unstructured data, there are no clear standards across the world right now, and it's been debated hotly. There aren't even common definitions of outcomes. But does that mean we should dismiss all this data, or can it tell us a bit about how individuals behave, what their outcomes are, what their preferences are, that is beyond the biology of the drug? I mean, Amazon probably knows more about you as individuals than your doctor. And that's not something we should just forego if it can help you to live a better life. So if you look right now, genetics and medical care probably accounts to a portion of your outcomes, unless you're a monogenetic disease and it's very, very precise. But what about your environmental and physical circumstances? Are you the asthmatic that unfortunately has to walk through a polluted industrial site and walk up 5 sets of stairs? And do we know that, and will the treatment still help you? So I think that we shouldn't ignore the fact that we are getting to a point of being able to start to look at some of this behavioral data and start to find potential solutions around it. So it's a good point of discussion. The regulators are also picking this up, and not to belay the point, FDA chief has mapped out a whole digital health plan. We have the 21st Century Cures Act, how can get treatments to patients sooner for diseases. What about the new EU Medical Device Directive? So it is becoming more permissive as long as we do the right experiments with the right knowledge. And as a consequence, all of the pharma companies are actually trying to kind of collaborate, whether it's data, whether it's technology, whether it's kind of setting up and looking at new technologies that can be miniaturized, new diagnostics. And this is, everyone's going into the digital bets in a pharma world. Such that, actually, this is an old slide, and I apologize, but shows that in the digital health space, there's nearly as much spending as there is in biotechnologies alone. So this is where the universe of trying to understand, is there something that's really fundamentally going to shift universally in the digital space? So I'm a firm believer that digital health is really embracing every part of clinical care. And this just gives you a very busy slide, but it also tells you it's complex and nobody's really cracked it today. That's why there's so much noise in the system. But there is a potential that actually we can reinvent medicine, and it'll actually democratize healthcare if we get it right across the world, because the technologies are enabling access and information to places that previously did not have that level of expertise. So just to quote, this is the Nobel laureate, Phil Sharp, Professor Sharp from MIT, and they've got the Koch Institute, where he said, look, he really believes this concept of superconvergence as a blueprint for moving forward. And not to read the entire quote, but the advances in many of these areas that were kind of really transformed engineering and the physical sciences is now being applied to life sciences. And what they have at the Koch Institute is they have the engineers next to the biologists, next to the data scientists, and they all commingle when they try to address problems. And they've got to a point where someone goes, well, I can miniaturize for immuno-oncology a little tool which has all the wells of different IO combinations, put it into a tumor, and actually locally measure its lysis and its effectiveness. So you don't have to go through all these trials, and you can work out, well, which is the right combination for you as an individual. There's no molecular biology, no molecular testing there. It's actually just a technology that they can develop. So you've heard this quote numerous times today, so I prepared the slide not knowing this is going to be the quote of the day from Victor Hugo. But I do believe in digital health, so I apologize for those who've used it before, that nothing can stop an idea whose time has come. So I'll stop there, and we'll start with I'd like to welcome up the panelists to debate any of these issues. And I hope you have lots and lots of questions, but in the meantime, we invite the panel up. Thank you.